Good evening, everyone. Today's the 6th of April, right? Today's a Saturday. Yeah, 6th of April, 2024. And this is actually the third day of the candidates. But however, I just felt we should check out some of the games that has been played so far. So I am going to go over some of the games that has been played in the open section of the candidates. So let's get right into it. The first game I want to go over is the game Fabiano Caruana versus the Caro Nakamura. These are two American players, two top players that we have in the US. And this was a Sicilian defense, which is a kind of like strange, defense to play at this level. Not that there's anything wrong with it. Number one, it's a very volatile defense. It's a defense you play when you're really looking to get a specific result. Like, let me use the word decisive result. And I just felt it's a little bit early. I mean, this is just my feeling. But you know what? When you're dealing with a Caro, you can expect anything. Why? He's such an entertaining player. So let's get right into it. It was a kind of like an odd Brazilian defense as well. So Karana went with the move e4. C5 was played by Nakamura. Knight f3, d6. Now with the move d6, this position can transport to several. We can go into the Nashdov, which is d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3 followed by a6. That could be transport to the Nashdov. Or we could transpose to the dragon, which is d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, followed by the move g6. However, we have a different line in this game, and I definitely know that this line was prepared by Karu. So in this position, d4 was played to grab as much squares in the center. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. Knight c3 defends the e4 pawn. e5. Now, I think this move is the move that I think Karu prepared for this particular line. And the e5 move has actually, you can look at it in two ways. Number one, yes, you have an attack on the knight on d4, probably going to force the knight to e2 or f3 or b3 or even f5. So, and the other thing the pawn does is the pawn gives away the d5 square. This can be a very huge factor for white in this game because looking at the d5 square, he actually has a knight on d5. He can get more pieces to control that d5 square, coupled with the fact that the queen also is looking at the d5. And all of a sudden, white is looking very good based on the control of that d5 square. So after the move e5, bishop check, that's an intermezzo, an in-between move, um, which was played by Fabiano. And I think this one was played to try to probably knock a Caro off his preparation because normally in this position you want to just move your knight. Like I said, move your knight back to a safe square. One of those squares that I just mentioned. B5 is not so much logical because you're not really threatening anything. But of course, the bishop b5 move comes, which is an in between move, and knight d7, and immediately knight f5. Makes a lot of sense. Why? We don't have the bishop on c8 looking at f5 square any longer. And now knight f5 actually threatens to win a pawn on d6. And of course, white also has to look at situations whereby he can reroute his knight to the d5 square. This looks pretty good for white. So, of course, a6 was played in the game immediately, putting pressure on the bishop. The pin on the king is not one black wants to really joke around with. So he has to respond to that move right away. After the move a6, bishop goes to a4, b5. The idea of the b5 is of not just to attack the bishop, but also to find a way to get the bishop on the b7 square, putting more pressure on the e4 pawn. So bishop b3 was played, and now knight to c5. Knight to c5 is threatening in a couple of things. Number one, the e pawn is attacked twice. Number two, we have the bishop also putting pressure on the knight on f5. I mean, this knight on f5 can be annoying. If you let this knight stay here for too long, it might not really go well for the black pieces. So it's very important you don't let a piece stay too long in your territory. Bishop g5 was played. I really like the way Fabiano is really approaching this game, getting all his pieces in the game as quick as possible. Let's just take a quick count of what's happening in this position. White has pretty much developed all his minor pieces. Bishop on b3, knight on c3, knight on f5, bishop on g5. Compare with the black pieces of the knight on c5, knight on f6, and I mean bishop c8 too. Might say yes, looking okay because he has opportunities to either go to b7 or take on f5. Now, of course, the problem piece for black in this position is the bishop on f8. Why? Because it really doesn't have a whole lot doing apart from the fact it's defending the d6 pawn. So right now we can actually say white is ahead in development, which in which when we think about positions like this in the half of such players as Ikaru, Fabiano, can be very decisive even amongst them. You can't really give Super Gems a whole lot of even the slightest advantage. You might really get in trouble for it. But Ikaru pretty much defended well in this position, and let's keep going and see how what happened. So Bishop captures on f5. It captures on f5. Bishop to e7. Now, like I said earlier, the e5 pawn gives away the d5 square. So if I can get a knight, if white can get a knight on d5 on a post, that will really give white a lot of play. And that could really cramp up black's position into a way where black is really going to have a very difficult game. So after the move bishop e7, it makes logical sense to capture the knight on f6. Why? Because it's the main defender of the d5 square. And that's exactly what Fabiano did. Bishop takes f6, bishop captures back. Now white castles. So let's check out the minor piece again. I always say this a lot. Always check out the placement of your pieces. It gives you an idea of what to do, what not to do. So looking at the minor pieces, white is looking pretty good as well. Still bishop on b3, knight on c3, putting pressure on the d5 square. Black has the active knight on c5, but a not so active bishop on f6. Why? Because it's being blocked by its own pawns. And if we just continue with this game with a gradual development, white can just easily build up his advantage. How? Just bringing the rooks to the d file, occupying the d5 square, putting pressure on the d pawn, and this could really put a lot of pressure on black's game. So let's continue here. Now, e4 makes a lot of sense. E4 makes a lot of sense. What's the point of e4? Earlier we were just talking about how bad this bishop is. All of a sudden, this bishop is not so bad because now the bishop can come to the e5 square, putting pressure on h2. Bishop is directly putting pressure on the knight on c3. And if the knight moves from c3, bishop can hit the pawn on b2. So all of a sudden, now we have this bishop trying to get into the game. But we have to also think about this. In a game of chess, time is such a big factor. White has developed all his pieces um, compared to black. Black is yet to develop all his pieces, most especially with the king being in the center squares. It could be a red flag for the black pieces. So after the move e4, knight captures on e4. Now, it's not a surprise knight takes e4 works. This is the thing. Anytime you are ahead in development, whatever tactics that happens in the game has to be in your favor. Why? Because you're already ahead in development. Now, how is it possible for the pawn to get captured, even though we have a knight on c5 protecting it? Because of the king's position in the center square. Now, after the knight takes on e4, rook e8, just get the knight back, get the piece back. And there's really nothing black can do about that. So black immediately castles, get the king out of danger. Rook takes on e4, bishop takes b2. So looking at the position, white is already a pawn up. And yes, white is a pawn up. His pieces are still looking better compared to black. Bishop has a very good diagonal, putting pressure on the f7 pawn. And the light squares are pretty weak for white. So it's easy for white to try to get some hold on the light squares. If he can do that, he can push his advantage and probably get something more from this position. So after bishop takes on b2, rook b1 has to be played. You don't want to lose your exchange for anything in this position. So bishop goes to f6. White goes to d5, immediately taking control over the central squares. Now, with the move queen d5, rook d1 is coming. You cannot move your rook to e8 because f7 is going to be weak. So white has a lot to play for in this position. Actually, let me see what the engine thinks about this position. Okay, the engine thinks a slight advantage white, 4.3. So let's keep going. Rook to c8. It's very important for black to activate its pieces, especially the rook to the c file. This is actually one of the main reasons why the defensive Sicilian is played. And the idea of the Sicilian defense is to create play on the c file. That's why you have after the move e4, c5 is played. So exchanging the c pawn for the d pawn gives black a lot of possibility to create play on that part of the board. So let's keep going. Queen b7, putting pressure on the weak pawn on a6. Rook to c5, attacking the weak pawn on f5. Queen takes a6, rook takes f5. And I think if you think about it, losing the a6 pawn for the f5 pawn. I mean, losing the f5 pawn of a6 pawn is not such a big deal. I think it's actually better for white. Why do I say that? Because white actually has a double pawn on the f file. So if you can help white get rid of his double pawn for your own a6 pawn, I think this has to be a better exchange of pawns for white. So let's keep going. Rook d1, getting all the last piece in the game, putting pressure on d6, actually threatening to win a pawn immediately. After rook to d1, d5 was played. After d5, of course, we can't capture this here because we have two pieces on that d5, even though we have two. But we need three pieces to be on d5 to be able to make a capture on d5. So rook goes to b4, attacking the pawn on b5. Bishop to c3. What's the point of bishop to c3? Of course, apart from the obvious idea of just taking the rook, what else is the idea of bishop to b3, bc3? Like what happened in the game? It was a game, it was a move that was played by Karu based on some drawing combination. There's some kind of perpetual check, which I think Fabiano saw and was able to prevent. So after the move bishop to c3, rook takes b5, there goes the move rook takes f2. After the rook takes f2, king takes f2 really to a draw immediately because there are several checks black is going to come up with which white cannot get out. But in the game, rook captures on d5 was played. Now, looking at this position, let's just break it down. White has three pawns, all on the same part of the board, three major pieces, and one minor piece. White has four pawns, two on one side of the board, two on the king side, two on the queen side, three major pieces, and a minor piece. Personally, looking at this position, I think white should be winning. White should be winning. White has a big advantage here. Let me use the word big advantage. Maybe winning is too big a word. But I think white should be able to convert because you have two pawns on the queen side. And of course, we always have to worry about the f7 pawn for black because of the bishop putting pressure there. So in this position, white is just looking very well. And of course, the threat is just to take, apart from the rook being hanging, the queen also is hanging. So queen goes to h4. And I'm sure in this position, Ekaru is just looking for ways to get some kind of perpetual check. And why is this thought possible? Because if you look at the position, there is no minor piece protecting this white king. And like I've said in the past, rooks are very bad defenders of the king. You know, if you want the best piece to defend your king, you want to use the minor pieces. Of course, apart from the fact of using the queen. So queen to h4 was played. After queen h4, queen to d3. What's the point of queen to d3? This just kind of butchers the point I just said. The best way to defend your king is using minor pieces apart from, the queen, because the queen can really do a whole lot of stuff. So in this position, queen d3 was played. So after the move queen to d3, rook goes to f6. Now the immediate threat is check on f2. Doesn't really do much, but after the king moves in, is it possible to check here? No, we can't check here yet. Now the bishop is still hanging. Now queen captures this is just going to be suicidal. For example, if he captures on c3, black is pretty much going to win the game in a few moves. And all of a sudden, game is over. So it's very important that we just keep an eye on every move made by our opponent. At this level, nobody's going to give you a free piece because they're nice or whatever. No, it's not going to happen. So after the move rook to f6, g3 was played, rightfully so. You have to play g3 because you had to control the f2 square. You can't allow the two pieces putting pressure on that square. So after the move g3, queen to a b4 was played. Now, what's the point of queen to b4? You have to defend the bishop on c3. Now, I'm thinking, what if he just pushes the pawn to a3? What's going to happen here? There's got to be some check somewhere. Let's see. So after move queen to b4, king g2 was played. Okay, I want to check this out. What happens if a3? What's the point of a3? I'm just trying to win this bishop. Let me see what the engine thinks. Oh, there's queen b6 check. Got it. Okay, so that's what I missed. So queen a3 doesn't work because there's queen b6 check and then the bishop can get away. So and I think that's what led to the move king to g2. So making sure that there are no checks, and now the immediate threat is just to play a3, winning the bishop on c3. So of course bishop goes to b2, moving away from danger. Rook f5, not the best move according to the engine. In this position, the engine suggested rook d7. I actually like the move rook d7. I like two moves here. I like the rook d7 and I like a4. What's the point of a4? In a game of chess, always remember this. You want to use your advantage. Okay? If your advantage is space, use it. If your advantage is time, use it. If your advantage is being ahead in the development, use it. If your advantage is an extra pawn, use it. If your advantage is having more pieces on the part of the board more than your opponent, use it. So basically, you want to use your advantages. Now, looking at this position, like I said, I like to move here. I like to move rook d7. Rook d7 puts pressure on f7 immediately. And of course, couple with the fact that we have the bishop on b3. That's one. And then, of course, I like the fact a4. What's the point of a4? I'm just going to keep pushing my pawn. a5, a6, just let the pawn keep going. That's the extra pawn. You have two extra pawns on the queen side. So just keep pushing the pawn. I personally think Karana had a lot of winning chances in this game. And I think if this was a last round game, I don't think it would have gone the way it did. This being the first round game. I think if any of the top GMs playing this candidate has this position as white and they need to win, I think they will be able to handle it. Nothing taking away nothing from Ikaro, who is a very good defender, but I just believe at this level, at that level, this position, I know if they really want to get a win, they would get a win. So let's keep going. Now Rook F5. Now I don't particularly like the move Rook F5. Because with the move Rook F5, I see black, white trying to just exchange pieces. But this is what you have to realize. It's not really about exchanging pieces here. It's about using your pieces you have to the maximum, right? You have to use your pieces to the maximum. So like I said, I like Rook D7 because it ties this Rook down to the F7 pawn, either rooks. And then we can just keep pushing our pawns, which could really make be a big deal for the black pieces. So let's keep going. Rook F5 was played. G6. Rook captures. Bishop captures. Now, based on the exchanges that just happened, I'm going to say something. Let me go back to this position. Based on the exchanges that just happened with the move Rook F5, this bishop all of a sudden has a chance of going back to safety on G7. Now, as long as the bishop is on B2, the bishop has to be careful about being trapped. But now, with the idea after the G6 rook captures, the bishop has a chance of going to G7, which looks pretty safe. And then he doesn't have to worry about his bishop on B2 getting trapped. So rook F5, like I said earlier, not the best move from Fabiano. After rook F5, G6 was played, rook captures, and bishop captures back, and queen to F3. What's the point of queen to F3? Putting pressure on the bishop on G7 and also the pawn on F7. Queen E7, defending the bishop and also defending the pawn. Just watch how grandmasters play. So now everything is defended here. But we have this pass pawn. White can just keep pushing. Just keep pushing that pawn. What's going to happen, we really don't know, but just keep pushing that pawn. Of course, it pushed the pawn a4, king g7. King g7 is a very good move. What's the point of king g7? It's important for black to move away from the bishop diagonal. As long as your king is on g8, you always have to worry about the pawn on f7 because you might need to move it at some point. But if your king is on g8, you cannot move the pawn. So a5, the pawn keeps going. Now, I would have preferred the pawn pushes while the other pair of rooks were on the board. Because in such situation, it's actually better for the person that has the more pieces on the board. You actually want to have more pieces on the board. So that because the more you go into an end game, the better black's chances of trying to draw. Number one, because of the obvious reason of having opposite colored bishops. So black can easily create a blockade on the dark squares, and there's nothing this white bishop can do about it. And the only way it can actually have a chance is for white to have a chance of winning an endgame in such manner is if these two pawns are connected. But they're not. The pawns are not connected because they've been separated by foul. So a5 was played, rook to a8. Of course, rook queen takes a8 doesn't fails to queen e2 check. And if king moves, there's a queen check. King moves back, you just simply come back check or just take the rook. So now Ikari is trying to solve his problem in a tactical manner. So rook to d5, protecting the pawn on a5, rook a7. Now I really like the way Ikari is defending this position. Now the rook is not just moving away from the x-ray attack, but also moving to the 7th rank to defend the f7, the queen, and all of a sudden black's position is looking really solid. It's hard for white to kind of make any headways in this position. So let's keep going. Um, rook to b5 was played. Queen to d8. Rook to d5. Queen to c7, threatening to win the pawn on a5. a4, h4. What's the point of h4? Now, the only point that I see behind the move h4 is to go to h3. Sorry, h to h5. Probably get in this pawn push check to win the bishop or try to mess up the black's pawn position. But I really don't think it's going to bring out anything. Why? Because you're talking about 3 pawns against 2 here. So it's kind of hard for these two to have any effect on these 3 pawns. So let's see what happened after that. So rook takes the pawn on a5. Rook takes back. Queen takes. Queen to b7, putting pressure on the square f7. The threat is just queen takes f7 check and all that. But I don't think it's such a big deal because even when you win the pawn on f7, as long as I can defend my bishop, the pawn here has no headways. For example, queen e5, queen takes f7 check. I can just move my king to h6, and queen f8 check doesn't work because I have my bishop here. So there is nothing really white can do in this position. And white also has to be careful because there are no pieces defending this white king right now. So let's see what happened after that. So queen d8, the same idea, defending the bishop and yeah, pretty much defending the bishop and stopping any check after queen f7. So queen f7 check, king goes to h6, king h3, queen to e7, trying to get an exchange of queens. Because if the queens are exchanged now, this is just going to be a straight out drawn position. Queen to c4, and queen d6, queen e3. Now, this is the point where it's actually harder for white to try to win this game. I think white had its winning chances much earlier. Like I said, in such a game, the more pieces you exchange, the easier it is for the defending side, for the weaker side. And after the move queen d3, this game ended in a draw. Was very interesting draw. The first game played between Fabiano and Hikaru Nakamura. So quickly, let's look at another game that was played in the same round. And this game was played between Abbasov Nijat, who is an Azerbaijani, and Nepomniachtchi Ian, who is a Russian. So let's really see what happened in this game. D4 was played this time. Knight f6, c4 was played, e6, knight to c3, d5. That's kind of like a queen's gambit decline. Why is it a queen's gambit decline? Because black is not trying to. Uh, I don't think black is going to try to capture the pawn. So normally after the d4 c4, pawn takes here means it's a queen's gambit accepted. But without the capture, it's a queen's gambit decline. So after the move d5, bishop g5 was played, and bishop to e7. These are all normal theoretical moves, and these positions have been played thousands of times. E3 was played. Idea of E3 is to get the bishop in the game. Number one, defend the pawn on C4. Just get his pieces developed. H6 was played. Bishop to H4. Captures on C4. Captures back. C5. Very interesting move. These are all normal moves. What's the point of C5? Trying to put pressure on white central squares immediately. And after the move C5, knight C6 is going to come, putting pressure on the pawn. So after the move C5, knight F3, you have to move the knight. What's the point of knight F3? Developing a piece one, also keeping some protection on the D4 square. So let's keep going. Sorry, excuse me. So let's keep going. Captures on D4, captures back with the pawn. Now, now, now we have a queen's gambit isolated pawn variation. And this is something I said in one of my earlier videos. When you're playing with the isolated pawn, you have to look for chances to attack the black king. Because if you don't, this pawn is going to get blockaded and eventually get captured. And once the pawn gets captured, you really don't have a whole lot of resistance. So anytime you're playing against an isolated pawn, right, you want to try to blockade the pawn and then capture. If you're playing on the side of the isolated pawn, you want to try and attack your opponent's king. So knight c6 was played. Castles keep the king safe. Black castles as well. Rook to e1, getting all the pieces in the game. So white pretty much has all the pieces in the game. Bishop on c4, knight on c3, knight on f3, bishop on h4, rook on e1. Compared to black, who has just 3 pieces in the game. Now, all this can really, really make a lot of difference if black doesn't do anything really fast. So a6. Now, the idea of a6 is to play b5 at some point with the idea of moving the bishop to b7, getting the last piece in the game. And at some point in time, the rook is going to come to c8. Queen might come to c7 with the other rook coming to d8. So these are all possible moves for the black pieces. So rook to c1. White's still keeping up with putting pressure on the position, getting all his pieces on the right squares. b5 is played. Bishop to b3. Now, it's important for white to keep this bishop to b3 because in some situations, white might want to move the pawn to d5. Why does white want to move the pawn to d5? By moving the pawn to d5, you actually improve your placement, the placement of your pieces, the activity of your pieces. So, even though it's a backward pawn, even though it's an isolated pawn, the more reason you want to try to exchange off the isolated pawn. If you have an isolated pawn, you cannot create an attacking chance on the black king. You have to look for ways to exchange off that isolated pawn. So bishop b7 was played. Bishop captures on f6. Bishop captures back. There you go, d6. Sorry, d5. Now after d5, black, like I said, black is pretty much just white is pretty much trying to exchange off the isolated pawn. And if he can exchange that off, he doesn't have to worry about defending the pawn. And now by exchanging off the pawn, his piece is also coming to play. So captures on d5, captures back with the knight, knight a5. Now knight a5 was played in the game. Now it's very important for black not to take the pawn on b2. Why? Because there's rook takes c6. After bishop takes c6, there's knight e7 check. King has to move. There's knight takes c6, and white is just winning. So it's very important that you have to look at all these possibilities. Like I said, at this level, people don't just give you free stuffs. So there was no way you're going to just get a free pawn just like that. So let's go back to the game. So knight takes d5, knight a5. And this move is a very logical move. Trying to exchange off the bishop, and then this makes this pretty weak. So knight takes f6 was played, knight takes back, queen to d4. Now the game is looking kind of even. Why do I say that? They are kind of exchanging into a position whereby all of a sudden there's no whole lot of stuff to play for. And queen d4 is also a very important move because especially with the fact that black is threatening to take on f3, doubling the pawns. So right now, for example, if queen captures on d4, the knight captures back. And if the knight takes on b3, the knight can still capture back, keeping the pawns intact. And it doesn't really look like anybody has any advantage in this position. So let's keep going. Queen takes d4, knight takes d4, rook a d8, rook a, rook c d1. It's important to move this rook on c to d1 so that the rook on e takes care of whatever happens on the e file. Knight takes on b3, knight takes on b3, bishop d5 attacking the pawn, the knight on c on b3. Of course, hoping to capture. If it doubles the pawn, some slight advantage for black. Is he going to be winning? We don't know. So he plays f3, and this is an important move. Why? Because the fewer the piece on the board, the more you have to start thinking about getting your king in the center of the board. Because your positioning of your king in any kind of game is very important. So f3 was played. Bishop takes b3, a takes b3, rook takes on e d1, rook takes back, rook to c8. The idea is just to come to the seventh rank, capture the pawn, and try and see what happens. So rook c2, rook d2. It's important for white to stop black from putting pressure on the pawn on b2 with the move rook c2. So rook d2 was played, king f8, rook to d, rook to e2. I like that move. What's the point of rook to e2? Stopping the king from coming to join the action. So if this king is going to come into this game, the king has to come this way. But then the king can only go as far as the f file. Why? Because we have a rook on the e file, stopping the king from joining. Very good move. And interestingly, the white king can actually come behind the the white rook, and then the white rook can get activated at some point. So rook to d8, king f2, rook to d4, rook e4, rook goes to d1, rook goes back to e1. Pretty much white is just trying to exchange pieces and settle for a draw. And I don't think there's anything black can do about that. Rook back to rook d4, rook to d1, rook e1, rook d2, rook e2, rook d4, and after the move rook e4, the game ended in a draw. So this was the second game, the second board which was played between Abbasov Nijat from Azerbaijan and Nepomniachtchi from Russia. Like I said, I could just say like they're just trying to feel themselves out. And like I said, it's the first round, so nothing really spectacular is going to happen. So let's look at the next game. The next game was between Firuja Alireza and Prague from India. Prague is a very entertaining player. Of course, so is Firuza. So let's see how this game went. This is also a game that ended in a draw. So e4 was played this time. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. The Roy Lopez is on the board. a6, bishop to a4, knight f6. All these are theory. Castles, knight takes e4, d4, b5, bishop to b3, d5, captures on d4. So he gets his pawn back. Bishop to e6. Of course, black just continues to develop his pieces. Bishop to e6 is played. At some point in time, bishop might come to e7 or c5. And then, of course, white wants to play rook e3. Rook to e1. Maybe knight c3, sometimes knight d2, just to exchange off this knight. This is another position that has been played so many times, even at the top and amongst tournament and club players. So c3 was played here. After the move c3, bishop to e7, bishop to c2. What's the point of bishop to c2? Trying to relocate this bishop to a square where it actually does more. And at some point in time, knight d2 is going to be played, trying to exchange off this knight because this is a kind of an annoying knight. The longer the knight stays on e4, the more problem the knight can cause. So after the move, bishop to c2, bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, getting away from the pin. This is a kind of like a weird move for me, like to my understanding, because normally I wouldn't want my king's position to be open. But then you have to think about this. If bishop captures on f3 and the pawn captures, there's a tempo on the knight. Once the knight moves, I always have f4 and f5. Now, having the two bishops with the two pawns in the center can be very dangerous for black. And I don't think black wants to get into such situation. So, knight c5 was played. Knight d2, defended the knight on f3. Knight to e6 was played. It's interesting to note that there are a lot of maneuverings happening here. And this is very important. Sometimes you want to put your pieces on the best squares before you actually make some strike. I mean, this is very important. So it's interesting to see how black is moving his pieces up and down, trying to look for the best positioning for the piece. Of course, there is no rush in castling right now because there is really nothing white can do to stop black from castling at any point in time he chooses to. But in the meantime, black is just trying to improve the placement of his pieces. And knight e6 was played after knight to e6, king h1. Interesting move, king h1. Why king h1, I really don't know. Probably is looking for an opportunity to use the g file in case the bishop captures. But I don't think bishop takes pawn takes would look good for white in this position. But let's just keep going. So bishop to h5, knight b3. Okay, now that makes sense. The reason they moved the king to h1 is to clear the g file in case the bishop captures on f3. So bishop takes f3 was played, g captures back, bishop to f to g5, rook g1, immediately putting pressure on the g file. Bishop takes c1, knight takes c1. What's the point of knight takes c1? Trying to reroute the knight to better square. Probably knight to d3, f4, f5 looks good. And one thing black has to be careful for in positions like this is when the position is a little open stroke loose, is always good for the person that has the bishop. But when the position is kind of close, it's always good for the person that has the knight. So I think white might still has a slight edge because on the one it has the bishop and the pawns can actually move freely, like both pawns. The pawns are not locked up. So rook knight takes c1, queen h4. Very interesting move. Immediately white decides to start to put pressure on this white king. But really there's really nothing much the black queen can do to this white king. So after the move rook queen to h4, rook g4 was played. Queen goes to h5, knight to d3, protecting the pawn on d4 twice because the pawn was attacked twice by the queen and the knight. So castles, queen to e2. What's the point of queen to e2? Still protecting the pawn and releasing the rook on the a file to come to the g file, putting pressure on g7. So f5, very strange move. Why do I say it's a strange move? Normally in a game of chess, you don't want to move your pawn to where you're being attacked. But on the other end, looking at this position, it makes a lot of sense for black to play the f5. Because by playing the f5, you can actually put pressure on the weak pawn on f3. Not just the weak pawn on f3, but the doubled pawn on f3. And now these pawns cannot defend each other. And the only way these pawns can be defended, the f3 and f2, is either by a piece, either a minor piece or a major piece or something like that. So f5 was played. He captures on f6. En passant, rook captures back. F4. And what's the point of f4? We have three pieces on f4. We have two pieces on f4. We have two pieces on f4, protecting. Now, knight takes f4 will be a blunder because there's knight takes on f4, and if the rook captures, there's rook takes g7 check, followed by queen takes queen on h5. So this is one reason why we also have to remember this. Anytime we have a piece that is undefended, we have to keep an eye on it. The black queen is undefended, the white queen is undefended. So if they are not careful, there could be a tactic that I can actually work against them. So what happened after the move um, f4? Let's see how the game continued. So rook to h6 was played, threatening checkmate. f3, defending the rook on g4, also defending the pawn on h2 with the queen. So rook goes to f8, attacking the f4 twice, although f4 is defended twice. Nothing to worry about. The queen goes to f2. What's the point of f2? Probably still keeping an eye on the pawn, definitely, because if you don't, there's going to be checkmate. And also trying to probably get away from this queen. What else? Probably, I'm not so sure, but it's important the queen stays on the second rank because of the h2 mate threat. So rook goes to f6, rook f to f6. The other rook comes to the center of the board. I was thinking maybe rook to g1, but come to think about it, if the rook goes to g1, I really don't see what white is threatening. As long as there's a knight on e6, you don't have much to do with the pawn on g7. So queen goes to f7, queen to g3, rook to h5, a4. What's the point of a4? Trying to create some play on other part of the board. And this makes a lot of sense for white. Why? Because white actually has the bishop. So when you have bishop, it's very important for you to create play on both sides. Why? Because your pieces can actually move from one side of the board to the other side in one move, compared to when you have a knight. So a4 makes a lot of sense. But I still think black has a slight edge here. Why? Number one, the white pieces are kind of tied to the king side. We have the doubled pawns you always have to keep an eye on. And there's no whole lot of um, points in black's position that white can just try to attack. I think the most vulnerable point in black's position is the g7, but it's defended by the queen, the king, and the knight. So even if we get a third piece, even if we get a third piece, that means you have the rook, well, the three major pieces. It's still nothing, black wants to be worried about. And if you cannot do much about the pawn on g7, then it's just damn difficult for black, for white to create some play. So that makes this a4 an interesting move. Like I said, the a4, for example, if captures, the rook can always come to a1 to try this check because of the weak back rank. So let's keep going. Rook goes to h6, threatening the check on f2, on h2. Rook e2 defends the check. Rook attacks the queen. Queen goes to e1. You have to get the queen away from the rook defending the h2 square. Rook takes on f3. Knight to c5. Now that's a decoy. And what's a decoy? What's a decoy? So what happens if the knight captures on c5? What happens if the knight captures on c5? I think rook check on e8 looks disastrous because the queen has to take, queen takes, and game is over. So this is a very interesting move. The knight to c5. It's the idea to remove the knight from the e file. So let's see how black responds to that. Queen to h5, threatening the rook on g4. Not mate. This is not a mate because we have a rook defending it. So let's keep going. Knight takes on e3. Queen takes on g4. Knight to g5, attacking the rook on f3 and threatening checkmate on e8. So knight goes to d4, stopping the checkmate. Knight goes to e5, sorry. Rook takes on e5. Rook takes check. Now, this is interesting. Because if you think about it, we have one, two, three major pieces all on the white side of the board. And how many pieces do we have defending this king? None. Think about it, none. So it's easy to, you know, to fall for these. I won't say fall for this rook check, which gets a draw immediately. But the thing is, the pieces already are looking. I mean, there is nothing else black is going to do because there's just a mate threat on E8. So black has to do something drastic. And of course, you really can't push any pawn to try and escape the mate because you're going to get mated on the seventh rank. So rook takes h2 is very common. Rook takes h2, king captures, queen check, king moves, queen check back, and after a couple of repetition of move, the game ended in a draw. And that was the game between Firuja and Prague. So let's look at the last game real quickly. The last game was played between Gukesh, another Indian super grandmaster, and Vidit. These two are super grandmasters representing India. And it's interesting to know India has three players among the eight players playing the candidate. So India has a very good chance of qualifying, for the candidate. If you ask me who are my picks, I'm going to mention Caruana and Gukesh. Why? I'll let you know in some other videos. There's an analysis I have on who I think those two could be the winner of this candidate. So let's check out this game real quickly. Um, D4 was played by Gukesh, D5, C4, E6, knight C3. Okay, we have the Taraj variation of the Queen's Gambit. What makes this the Taraj variation? Now, after the regular D4, D5, C4, E6, knight C3, the move C5 makes it the Taraj variation. I really like what I'm saying because these are not regular defenses you see the super grandmasters play. So this pretty much means they have actually done their preparation. Of course, you have to. If you're trying to become the world champion, you must have some preparation, something to show, and especially maybe something you're not really used to playing, something you must just prepare with your second. So it makes a lot of sense to see these defenses and openings that we're seeing, which these players do not regularly play. So c5 was played, e3, maintaining the tension in the center, not taking any of the pawns. So knight to f6 was played, still maintaining the tension in the center. Knight f3 is played. Knight c6, still maintaining the tension in the center. What do I mean by maintaining the tension? If you look at this position, we have knight on f6, f3, c6, c3. But we have pawn on c5, c4, d5, and d4. These pawns can actually capture each other. The fact there are no pawn captures means the tension is being maintained. So the moment somebody captures a pawn, the tension is his. And sometimes when you capture a pawn in a game, you want to make sure that it actually works for you. Because if you're not so sure about it and you make a pawn capture, even though you exchanging a pawn for a pawn, those exchange might actually work against you. So you have to be careful about that. So let's see how the game continued. A3. Now, A3 is an interesting move. What's the point of A3? White is looking to capture on C5 with the idea of B4 and then maybe bishop to B2. And then white has a very nice position. But all these positions has been played before, nothing spectacular. So after the move A3, A6 was played by black. Very symmetrical position, if you ask me. Yes, I think we have almost the same position. Yes, it is the same position. So after the move A6, now it captures on D4 on C5. This is what I just mentioned earlier. You want to be able to get something anytime you ease the pressure in the center. So after taking on C5, bishop takes on C5, B4 was played, attacking the bishop, gaining some space. The bishop is going to come to B2, putting pressure on the long diagonal. Bishop goes to D6. Rook A2. This is an interesting move. What's the point of rook A2? The rook is switching to the D file, putting more pressure on the D file, especially with the number of pieces of black we have on the D file. We have the D pawn, we have the rook, the bishop on D6, we have the queen on D8. So rook A2, rook D2 is a very interesting move. I don't know if I've seen this, but based on the database, it's been played before. So knight goes to d e5, rook d2, captures on f3, g captures f3. Now, I want to mention something about this capture. Now, at this level, all these guys have seen a whole lot of openings, a whole lot of games. I mean, they have several games, thousands of games in their database. If you're trying to win a game at this level, you have to do something out of the norm, something that's not normally seen. You have to do something along that line. And not just do something along that line, but you have to have some concrete analysis to back it up. So what am I talking about? In this position, most people would almost will go with the queen captures. Why? Because they don't want to double the pawns on the king side and expose the king. So when two strong players play, these are guys that knows all the opening, they know a lot of theory about the openings, and it's very important that you have some extra if you're trying to beat somebody as strong as you, because almost every opening, they have an idea, a very good idea. So you're not going to just blow them off from the opening. There has to be some extra thing you want to do. It could be like a preparation. It could be a surprise move. They are not expecting, which is a move you've actually planned, which is a move you've actually worked on. So after knight takes f3, g captures on f3, castles, bishop to b2, a5. It's important a5 is played. Why? As long as this king is in the center, you want to open up the position. Even if the king finds itself on g1, you still want to try to open up the position. Because the more open the position is, the more this king can get into some trouble. So um, a5 was played, captures on d5, d e5 was played. Knight to b5. What's the point of knight b5? No immediate threat. You're not trying to win a piece here, or probably trying to get rid of the bishops, because the nightmare of this king will be having two bishops on the board, just trying to put pressure on this king's position. So knight b5 was played, takes on, captures on b4, captures the bishop first, captures back, takes on b4, queen takes on queen takes on b4. Now let's take a break and just check out what's happening in this position. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. White has developed one minor piece, major pieces. Black has developed his knight. Even though this bishop can't get in the game, I think this bishop is good to go. But the most obvious difference in this position is the positioning of the king. White's king and black's king. It's obvious that the black's king is not looking, sorry, the white king is not looking good right now. Apart from the fact it's stuck in the center, it's in a pin. So it's very important white does something fast. Otherwise, this pin can work against him. So queen c2 was played. And what's the point of queen to c2? Not sure. Probably if the knight captures, bishop to d3 can be played with the threat of taking on h7 and then the threat of just keeping the king safe. So bishop g4 was played. White, black is not giving white any chance of trying to, excuse me, get his position together. So, and of course, you cannot capture on g4 because rook to c8 is really going to spell a lot of doom for the white pieces. For example, if let's say, for example, if it captures on g4, I think it has to be the f rook. Let me see what the engine thinks. Yeah, it has to be the rook f8 is just crushing. Rook f8 is just crushing because this king is going to remain in the center. Why is he going to remain in the center? Because once the queen moves away, we have even if you get bishop e2 in, you cannot castle because this rook is hanging. So the g bishop, the bishop on g4 cannot be captured. So instead, what did white play here? He played bishop to c3, queen goes to a3, bishop to b2, queen b4, and he simply settles for the draw. And after queen b4, the game ended in a draw. Like I said, it's not. It's very important that white doesn't fall for. Of course, at this level, they cannot fall for that. So this is the first game from the the first round, the open section candidates 2024. I'll pretty much say the all the players who are just trying to fill out themselves, being the first round. Nobody's doing anything extraordinary, and it's not surprising that in the next couple of rounds things are really going to heat up. Okay, that's about it for today, and we're going to talk about the other games. Of course, at some point in time, we're going to touch on the women's games as well to see how they're playing. And yes, please kindly check out the games. Come up with some suggestions about some contribution about whatever it is. What black should have done, what black should have done. Maybe there's an improvement. We see there's somewhere improvement somewhere that we're not seeing that you as a viewer can see. Okay, that's it for now, and see you soon.